Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is John Hardie, the Deputy Director of the FDD's Russia program. John, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
I want to talk about where exactly we are when it comes to negotiations and ending the war between Russia and Ukraine. In recent days, U.S. officials met with President Volodymyr Zelensky for peace talks in Berlin. President Trump said that he believes that we're closer now than we have ever been to striking the deal to end the Russia-Ukraine war. So to start off the conversation, what are your thoughts on the current state of negotiations?
Yeah, I think we are fairly close to consensus on the U.S., Ukrainian, European side, although there is the very significant caveat regarding territory. That said, bridging that gap between what's acceptable to the Ukrainians and what's acceptable to the Russians is obviously quite a challenge and easier said than done. So once there's consensus on one side, you kind of have to take it to the Russians. I suspect they've kind of been doing that behind closed doors, but there may be another kind of Witkoff-Kushner trip to Moscow. That'll be really where the hard work is.
And I think that that gap has really been impossible to fill in recent negotiations. When Russia's happy and they say, hey, we're close to a deal, Ukraine says no, and vice versa. And the big sticking point seems to be territory. And I'm obviously simplifying this a bit here. Ukraine says we are not conceding any sort of territory. Russia says we want the territory. I mean, realistically, what's going to happen here to get a deal?
Yeah, I think you're right. That is one of the main sticking points, although I think not the only one. The security guarantee kind of question is also very, very important. I think on territory, to me, a realistic scenario is a ceasefire along current lines, and you have some sort of demilitarized zone where both sides pull back. That to me is reasonable and realistic. If you think about Zelensky's domestic political environment, in Ukraine, withdrawing from the rest of the Donbass and eastern Ukraine unilaterally, the territory that Russia has so far been unable to take, that's synonymous with capitulation. And Ukraine just isn't, Vladimir Putin is demanding that Ukraine accept a loser's peace, despite the fact that Ukraine has not lost this war. So that sort of thing is just not acceptable.
And I guess my next question would have to be, is there a world in which Russia accepts a deal where they don't get any territory like the Donbass region?
I don't know. I do know that right now Putin does not seem very inclined to compromise. He still seems confident, in fact, overconfident in his military's ability to kind of achieve his minimal objective of taking the rest of the Donbass through force if necessary. So I think if we are going to reach a place where the Russians are willing to compromise to kind of accept terms that Kyiv can live with, Putin's mindset is going to have to change, and so that can happen through kind of longer hostilities, with kind of proving to him that Ukrainian forces can't be ground down or broken. It can be proven to him through economic ways, kind of strictly enforcing these new oil sanctions, kind of putting the Russian economy and the Kremlin's finances in more of a bind.
And Zelensky has long said that he wanted Ukraine to be part of NATO, but he said in these recent rounds of negotiations, he's willing to drop this idea of Ukraine having NATO membership in exchange for U.S. security guarantees. What do you make of that?
Well, I think Zelensky is kind of recognizing reality that, at least in Washington and some other European capitals, that there's not consensus on bringing Ukraine into NATO. That's true on a bipartisan basis here in D.C. I think it's important to note that Zelensky is not saying he's willing to try to amend the Ukrainian constitution to kind of remove that NATO aspiration, which is what one of the things Moscow is demanding.
And these U.S. security guarantees, they would be similar to the Article 5 security guarantees in the NATO alliance. So really, what's the difference when it comes to the United States' point of view?
Well, I think that's one of my concerns about what's being kind of put on offer is we're making these fairly grandiose promises. And I think if you look fairly shallowly below the surface, there's no willingness in DC, and especially on the part of President Trump, to follow through on that. And so I'm a little concerned we're getting out over our skis and kind of setting ourselves up to have that bluff called. I mean, after all, this war is a continuation war of the 2014-2015 war. There could very well be a third war I would hate to see us kind of bluff and then kind of have our credibility questioned, which could have implications for credibility of our actual Article 5 for NATO.
And then based on that, based on the fact that you think that this could be a bluff, we could be getting over our skis here, when Russia hears this, because they're not involved in these talks in Berlin right now, what do you think that they're thinking, specifically Vladimir Putin?
If you think back to why Putin launched this war, it was to prevent Ukraine from basically joining the West, escaping Russia's sphere of influence. He wants to keep Ukraine kind of close to Russia, under Russian domination. He wants to keep it vulnerable so that he can kind of dictate its foreign policy and a degree of its domestic policy, kind of like Belarus. So yeah, he obviously does not want to see Western security guarantees. He wants guarantees that are really empty, where Russia has a veto. That's exactly what the Russians proposed in 2022 and are proposing now.
I know you said earlier in the conversation that European leaders seem really happy with the way the talks between Ukrainian officials as well as U.S. officials are going and where the United States' position is in all of this. And I want to read what some of them have said. Germany's chancellor posted this on X. For the first time since the war began, the possibility of a ceasefire is conceivable. And Poland's prime minister reportedly told the media that this was the first time, quote, that everyone was behaving like allies from one camp. And it was the first time that he heard from U.S. negotiators, quote, that America would engage in security guarantees for Ukraine in such a way that the Russians would have no doubt that the American response would be military if the Russians attacked Ukraine again. And U.S. officials reportedly told reporters that they were about 90% through with negotiations. There's 90% agreement when it came to the Ukrainian side. The only thing left to really hammer out was territory. When it comes to Russia, do you think that Russia feels that way, that they are about 90% closer or on the way to a deal?
And so I think when the U.S. officials said that, they were talking about kind of consensus on the U.S., Ukraine, European side, and perhaps that's true. Although again, territory is the big sticking point. But no, that position that's kind of coming out of Berlin and the Russian position are still a world apart. I think there is some cause for optimism in that we are perhaps closer to peace than we have been since 2022. That does not mean we're close yet.
And when do you think we will get there, if at all?
I think this war still has probably a good 6 months left in it, at least. I hate to offer too firm a prediction because my crystal ball broke a long time ago. But yeah, to me, it just does not seem like Putin is yet ready to accept a real compromise. And until that changes, I'm just skeptical, unfortunately, about the prospects for a settlement.
And I feel like this is a similar conversation in the past few months, depending on what side it is. It seems like there's a few steps with either U.S. officials and Ukraine, and then on the other side, when U.S. officials talk to Russian officials, there's a few steps that way. But Russia and Ukraine aren't really moving in lockstep. So specifically, what are you looking out for next?
Well, so we now have this kind of emerging consensus on the security guarantees on the part of the West and Ukraine. I'm looking to see when that's taken to Moscow, how is it altered? I mean, if you look at the original kind of Witkoff-Dmitriev 28-point plan that caused a stir in the press on both sides of the Atlantic, that had very different language on security guarantees than some of what the Europeans are asking for, namely the multinational force in Ukraine and troops in Ukraine, U.S. support for that. I think even the original language was unacceptable to Moscow. The troops in Ukraine certainly is. So in a kind of a subsequent draft, the U.S. promised to kind of oppose that idea. Now they're perhaps saying they'll support it. It's unclear. Let's see how that changes and kind of what comes out of the next meeting with Moscow.
My last question to you would be, when you're looking at the United States' role in this, what do you make of that? Because it seems like whenever the U.S. is talking to one side, that side is closer to an agreement, and then the other side still isn't there yet. How would you grade the role of the U.S. envoy and the U.S. negotiators in these peace talks?
Well, I like what we're doing right now, which is kind of trying to develop a consensus with the allies and with Ukraine, and then kind of taking that to Moscow, trying to work the Russians down onto a compromise. I don't like what the Witkoff and President Trump initially did, which was, okay, let's cook up a plan, kind of in secret with the Russians, and then try to impose it on Ukraine. That didn't work. It won't work. And I think, we kind of lost a lot of time. And unfortunately, perhaps fueled Russian intransigence after they see, okay, clearly these guys are kind of amenable to our demands and trying to impose those on Ukraine. After the Russians see that, why would they compromise?
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for. As you said, you think that this still has a good 6 months or so. And as we see major developments coming out, I hope you can come back on and join me. John Hardie, thank you so much for your expertise. I always appreciate your perspective.
Glad to do it.